All right, Salam. Welcome back to our first Rastafari historical reading of our book, I book, entitled The Black Jews of Africa, History, Religion, Identity. And we will be continuing from the last chapter, chapter 9, which is African Jews in Western and Central Africa. Today we will be reading on the Tutsi Hebrews of Havilah. But before I read on, I just want to go to the burning bush here real quick. Okay, brothers and sisters, let's proceed. Oh, it's Shabbat Shalom, Sembe Salam to all the brothers and sisters, and to the new subscribers. Give thanks for subscribing, and let's get into this. The Tutsi Hebrews of Havilah. From the late 1980s, a group of Tutsi who have their origin in the Great Lakes area claim that this region was the home of a Hebraic community in ancient times, and they assert a Jewish identity. They refer to their homeland, which allegedly extends far beyond the regions where the Tutsi now reside, as Havilah. According to the name given in Genesis chapter 2, verse 11, to the legendary territory irrigated by the Pishon River. Since 1999, the movement's headquarters is in Brussels, Belgium, where intellectual Tutsi expatriates in Europe have founded the Havilah organization. According to the ideology, they focus their efforts on the Hebraic remnants of pre-Talmudic tribes of Israel, isolated on the other side of the rivers of Ethiopia. Zephaniah chapter 3, verse 10. During a festival held in 1990 in Nigeria, Tutsi intellectuals celebrated the physical reunification of the lost tribes of Havilah, Gulhan, and Futa Dijalon at a date that, in order to show the symbolical reference, corresponded to Pesach, the Jewish festival celebrating the end of slavery and the departure from Egypt. In 1999, during an inaugural conference of the Havilah Institute, its president, Professor Verde, proclaimed from Brussels the Judaization of all Tutsi. This conference was structured around revealing themes such as under the sign of the armorial bearings of Havilah, the Star of David, a characteristic of the modern states of Israel and Burundi, or Solomon's drums, of which the Shabbatic sovereigns of Havilah are the guardians. The Havilah Institute is an organization that claims to assemble 7 centers of research, intervention, and influence settled on nearly every continent. These centers bring together high-level Tutsi expatriates who are experts in the economic, financial, political, and military sectors. In the words of Professor Verde, the charismatic leader of Havilah, these centers are dedicated to restoring and reviving the lost memory of the 12 Hebraic codes, for which thousands of years characterized the civilization of Cushitic peoples of southern Abyssinia, or Ethiopia, Rwanda, Burundi, Ankole, and Buhava, and settled on the fringes of the White Nile and guardians of King Solomon's mines. Today, in claiming their Hebrew identity, the Tutsi combined the Hamitic myth and Afrocentrist arguments. From a theological point of view, Professor Verde affirms that the cultural and religious references to the Batutsi have perpetuated either pharaonic monotheism from the 18th dynasty of Egypt or the Mosaic prescriptions transcribed in the Hebraic Torah. He states that the political organization of the Batutsi kingdoms, from the Kush kingdom until post-Zagwe kingdoms, 1270 to 1960, are strictly related to the Solomonic system. He considers that the ancient material civilization of the Batutsi, their language, their mythology, their religion, and their political legacy, and their general way of life, all those matters can be described exactly as related by Eldad Hadani. The self-image of the Tutsi is largely the creation of outsiders, which is to say that it is fundamentally an identity that has been imagined into existence. The first explorers to reach the region of Rwanda and Burundi were immediately struck by the differences they observed between the three groups of Hutu, Tutsi, and Twa, the tall, lithe, and angular. Tutsi were perceived as being quite different from the Hutu and Twa. In his Journal of the Discovery of the Nile, 1863, the explorer John Hanning Speke proposed an explanation of these differences by a theory, according to which the Tutsi, after having migrated from the north, subjugated the groups around them and became the ruling caste. He considered them closely allied to the pastoral Gala of southern Ethiopia, the Oromo, and the idea that the Tutsi were superior to the other groups of the region persisted. In comparing them to the Hutu and the Twa, with whom they shared the same territory, Mary H. Bradley, during a 1926 visit to Tanganyika, wrote of the sophisticated Watutsi of Rwanda, who have a precise theology and elaborate account of the creation of the world. She asserted, their stories come from the north, with these tribes of pronounced Hamitic and Semitic origins, Kamo-Shumitic origins. In the 20th century, long after Speke's and Bradley's assertions, colonial administrators whose judgment had been formed by these cliches undertook to convince the Great Lakes region's elite of their innate superiority. Pierre Richmonds, who for 10 years was resident administrator in Burundi, states the Batutsi were destined to rule. Their very appearance is enough to assure them of a considerable prestige among the inferior races that surround them. The Catholic Church, which has long been one of Rwanda's most powerful institutions, generated substantial discourse and additional evidence of the Tutsi origins. In 1933, Father Pages asserted that the Tutsi, as well as the Pil, were Hamite Semites who had come from Egypt and Abyssinia in caravans accompanied by black porters. The Rwandan priest Alexis Kagame, in addition to his prestige as a man of the church, played an important role in enabling the Hamitic ideology to take root within the indigenous population through his contribution to the writing of the history of Rwanda. What's his Magur? Looks like manager. Magur Leon Classe, Archbishop of Rwanda, wrote in 1922, the population of Rwanda is composed of three races: the Batutsi, which is the noble class, the Bahutu, or common people, and the Batwa, or pygmies. excuse me, the Tutsi are not Bantu. They are. If you prefer Negroids, and they are the people in Africa who have the highest Hamitic index. A long time ago, before the Christian era, there were in Asia Minor important migrations of people who went to Egypt, then populated Abyssinia and progressively spread southward. This is the likely origin of our Tutsi. The perenniality of the Hamitic myth is striking. In 1978, Paul del Perugia, who had been French ambassador in Rwanda, wrote in his book Les Deroy Mages, whatever. The Hamite came very late, at the end of the 13th century, to the inner lake area. Everything made them irreducible to the Bantu. The Hamites are neither Negroid nor Europoid. The origins of their splendid race remain still mysterious. He concluded that they were, in a way, magi, or white supremacy confusion. In what context did the Tutsis' claim of a Jewish identity arise? Although there had always been class divisions, the colonial Belgian government decided in the 1930s to officially categorize the Hutu and Tutsi by drawing artificial distinctions between the two based on their ethnic background and distribution of power. When the Belgians declared the country independent in 1962, a system of inequality and violence instituted by Rwanda's first elected president, Gregor Kayamba, leader of the Sol Parmehutu party, ensued. The policy of labeling people with ethnic identity cards, begun by the Belgian government, was continued and used to discourage mixed marriages. Beginning in the 1970s, thousands of Tutsi were forced to resign from medical or educational positions, or forced into exile, or worse, killed. For the subsequent governments, the issue of ethnicity remained a source of tensions, each ethnic group holding on to the memory of past memories. Each group holding on to the memory of past massacres. New waves of ethnic clashes were unleashed in the 1990s. The main causes included a sagging economy and food shortages, and a subsequent mass flight of refugees that contributed to create a dangerous political climate. Violence escalated up until 1994, when a genocide of unprecedented swiftness officially left 937,000 Tutsis and moderate Hutsis dead at the hands of organized bands of militia. Since their terrible suffering, the Tutsi describe their history as a microcosm of worldwide Jewish history, including key words such as genocide, pogrom, Shoah, persecution, and anti-Semitism. Professor Bwejeri wrote, "For the last 40 years, the Batutsi have been exterminated. Until now, they are being exterminated because of their Hebraic identity and the Solomonic legacy." Following this, the spokesman of Tutsi Hebrews called out to Israel and the international community to condemn and take measures against the anti-Semitic violence in Africa toward the 500,000 Tutsi of Rwanda. They also turned to the Jewish organizations of the diaspora, and particularly of the United States, asking for their support. There is no doubt the theory of the existence of an ethnic kinship between Tutsi and Hebrews carries an important emotional and historical charge for themselves, and also for the descendants of victims of the Holocaust who provided significant support for the Tutsi cause. In the autumn of 2004, the Kulanu president observed the deterioration of the status of a remnant of the biblical people of Cush so far up the Nile from the more familiar Beta Israel of Ethiopia challenge us in more ways than is tolerable. We can ask that there is no more trouble for these proud upholders of an ancient national and religious tradition. U.S. members of Congress have been alerted, and now they must be encouraged to transform their concern into action. In Europe, Jewish organizations took charge of demonstrations against the Tutsi genocide, such as that which was held on June 8, 2005 in Brussels under the auspices of the Committee of Coordination of Jewish Organizations of Belgium, under the banner "No Impunity for the Negation of the Genocide of Armenians, Jews, and Tutsi." Nonetheless, it may be that considerations other than religions, that is, strategic and political, encourage the approach of the Tutsi Hebrews to their identity. Denouncing the breakdown of the Arusha Accords, Havilah decided in 2002, through the voice of Verde, who now holds the title of Prince of Nkoronko, to launch a political attack they named Geula, redemption, whereby the Batutsi are reclaiming their sovereignty, their lands, and principles of their multi-millenary civilization inherited from their ancestors, the Kushites, from South Abyssinia. These arguments fall within the scope excuse me. Okay. Okay, inherited from their ancestors, the Kushites from South Abyssinia or Ethiopia. These arguments fall within the scope of a Jewish Zionist model, but the Tutsis' claims are analyzed by some people as a political ideology of domination. In an article entitled Judaization des Tutsi, Identity au Stratégie de Conquête, in 2000, Eric Kenness considers that the opportunist thesis of the existence of an ethnic kinship between Tutsi and Hebrews, which was built inside secret layers, is presently spreading out. A maneuver brilliantly orchestrated by the former and intended to suppose their metamorphosis to Hebrew Tutsi on the rest of mankind worldwide. According to the Kenness, this political manipulation coincides with the wars that shake the African Great Lakes region, and its only aim is to get support from Jewish groups and Western partners. Between the Hamitic myth and Afrocentric thesis, and through the absorption of ideologies, as successive elaborations took place, we have a striking example of the way the myth of Tutsi Hamite origins has been transformed into a recent Tutsi Jewish identity. In May 1999, the Canadian newspaper National Post published an article on the Hema, another black people of the Great Lakes area who, following genetic analysis, claim they are black Jews who descend from Aaron, from Aaron, Moses' brother, from Muse's brother. This statement coincided with the beginning of the Havilah movement finding its voice in Brussels, and the spread by the media of the first scientific information on the Jewish origin of the Lemba and the Cohen modal haplotype, to be developed in the next section. This process by which the Tutsi developed a Jewish identity is very similar to the history of the Baluba in the Congo, whose upper classes were viewed as special and therefore extraneous in colonial times. This process, which has continued to the present day, might have been encouraged by a book, In the Heart of Bantu Land, written in 1969 by D. Campbell, in which the author noted, northward of Katanga lives one of the greatest tribes of Central Africa, the Baluba, who are undoubtedly of Semitic origin. The name Baluba means the lost tribe, and the language and customs have many Hebrew affinities. Their name for an idea of God, with their word for water and people, and many other words and ideas show their Semitic strain. More recently, the idea of the Jewish identity of the Luba was mentioned in a publication of the United States Institute of Peace. The report observes that since the early 1960s, the Luba administrative, social, and commercial elite have spread all over the Congo country to form an ethnic diaspora which has been viewed with suspicion by the rest of the political class. The report, which confuses identity, elements, and political arguments, as was observed with respect to the Tutsi, defines the situation of the Luba as follows. Okay. 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 As early as the 1960s, the Baluba regarded themselves as the Jews of the Congo, and some of their notorious leaders, for example, J. Nagalula, were called Moses. They felt persecuted by most other ethnic constituencies who disliked the privileges the Baluba allegedly garnered under the white administration. During the Second Republic, they remained highly visible in politics. President Mobutu's strategy was to consistently absorb the Luba elite into the highest level of the political hierarchy in order to better control it. Since 1978, one of the harshest opponents of the regime among the Luba has been Etienne Tshisekedi, later named the Zairan Moses, who together with 10 fellow Kassians led a protracted struggle against Mobutu. In almost all of the regions and provinces, the Luba diaspora was implicitly accused of wanting power only for its people. Like the Shabans, the Luba are threatened with expulsion by the native sons. The grievance of the Jews of Zaire, once again resonates. It seems today that the Luba are fully aware of this discourse which they have espoused, particularly the consideration that the etymology of the name Luba conveys the sense of a lost tribe. Okay, Cape Verde Israel Friendship Society. Recently, in the Republic of Cape Verde, some Afro-Portuguese who assert that they are descendants of Jews who settled there as part of the colonization by Portugal have openly reclaimed their identity. They recall in ancient Jewish presence, which they trace back to an emigration related to the Inquisition. Following Cape Verde's independence from Portugal almost 20 years ago, more Cape Verdeans are taking interest in their history and ancestry. Although none of them seem to be practicing Jews, many are aware of both their own Jewish ancestry and the history of a Jewish presence in Cape Verde, or a Jewish settlement on other islands. Some who have North African Jewish patronymics are descendants of Moroccan immigrants who settled in this island in the 19th century and traded hides and pelts, or were engaged in another commercial activity. Considerably more is known about the Cape Verdeans of Moroccan Jewish ancestry than those of Portuguese ancestry. In Praia, Praia, the capital of Santiago Island, these people have banded together to form the Cape Verde Israel Friendship Society. The society is headed up by Dr. Januario Nascimento. All right, anyway, a descendant of a family from Tangiers that arrived around 1850 to 1880 and founded a synagogue. Although little has been written on this subject, fascinating oral accounts have been provided by Cape Verdeans as fragments of individual or collective memory. One man affirms that his father was Jewish because he and some other men would get together, cover their heads, and read a language that looked like Arabic, adding that his father told him to be skeptical about what the Catholic priest might tell him. Another man remembers a family story about a great-grandfather, a new Christian, who was forced to join the clergy. He mutilated his hand on a sewing machine so as to be unable to conduct mass and thus escape. In a public meeting, one young woman spoke of her family's aversion to pork and wanted to know about other practices that might link her to Judaism. Among the various objectives of the Cape Verde Israel Friendship Society is the restoration of 3 Jewish cemeteries, in particular that of Penha Franca on Santo Antão Island. For the time being, these people essentially want to rediscover their Jewish past, not to convert to Judaism. They want to know more about their background, ask for scholars to come to Cape Verde to conduct research on the subject, and exchange ideas with Israelis and American Jews. In the same way in Angola, probable African descendants of 16th century Lancados who bear Jewish names recently discovered their Jewish ancestry without knowing anything of Jewish traditions. The Israeli ambassador Tamar Golan, during her visit to Angola, stated, "They do not know about the law of return, and they have no intention of immigrating to Israel. We are not trying to force religion or tradition on them, but we have noticed that since representatives of Israel came to Angola in 1955, there is growing pride among them. Everywhere they go, they say they are cousins of the embassy. Even the former foreign minister, Paulo Jorge, said to me, 'I have Jewish blood.' Since then, the embassy has invited Since then, the embassy has invited some of them to receptions and to the Passover Seder. Thus, in present times, Jewish roots that have been tightly interwoven with African or Creole cultures are emerging and celebrated in the context of building a new sense of collective pride." Among these groups concerned with Judaism, some justifiable historical claims are intertwined with the myth of the lost tribes and revised versions of the Hamitic myth adapted to their own ends. We shall examine an East African group, the Abayudaya of Uganda, which in a sense defies the overall conclusion posited above, in that while forming part of a worldwide network of recent claimants to a Judaic ancestry, they may be viewed as a phenomenon of spontaneous adhesion to Judaism, original Judaism. And that will conclude that chapter, chapter 9 of African Jews in Western and Central Africa. Our next chapter will be chapter 10, African Jews in Eastern and Southern Africa. And I just want to wish the eye in them. I just want to say Shabbat Shalom, Senbet Salam to all the brothers and sisters. Give thanks to the new subscribers. Stay tuned for this is actually the last chapter in our first reading here of the Black Jews of Africa. So stay tuned for chapter 10, African Jews in Eastern and Southern Africa. And we will be reading on the Abayudaya of Uganda. All right. And with that, I say Selam.